The beginning of Mark's gospel begins with these words: the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. However, this gospel does not end with the words, the ending of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. In fact, the oldest manuscripts that we have of Mark end with this 8th verse. Not only are we left with the astonishing news that the women said nothing, but the last verse in the oldest manuscript that we have ends in the middle of a sentence with the word "for." As listeners, we are left with no choice but to wonder, for what? For when? For whom? Nothing follows. How amazing. When is an ending not the end? When the story ends in the middle of a sentence and when a dead man raises from the dead. Will you join me in prayer? Oh, gracious God, help us to become masters of ourselves so that we might become the servants of others. Take our minds and think with them. Take our lips and speak through them. Take our hands and work with them, and take our hearts and set them on fire with your Spirit. Amen. You know, I totally get the women. I can totally empathize with them. I mean, they set out expecting the small consolation of a decent burial. And as they make their way, their primary concern seems to be a practical one. How are they going to move the stone that seals the tomb? Finding the tomb empty, the women forget that question altogether and begin asking new, frightening questions. Despite the messenger's reassurances, the women are alarmed. They know what to do about death. You anoint a body. We know what to do about death. What are they supposed to do with this, an empty tomb? What about us? Like those women, we have two alternatives, at least two that I can see. One, you can either question your belief or you don't. Either we accept our fixed versions of reality or we can challenge them. Can we stay open and curious, flexible, without needing to figure everything out? A story is told of a man's only son reported dead in battle. Inconsolable, the father locks himself in his house for 3 weeks, refusing all support and kindness. In the 4th week, the son returns home. And seeing that he is not dead, the people of the village are moved to tears, and overjoyed, they accompany the young man to his father's house. Whereupon he knocks on the door. "Father, I have returned." But the old man refuses to answer. "Your son is here, he was not killed," called the people of the town. But the old man was not would not come to the door. Go away and leave me to grieve. I know my son is gone forever, and you cannot deceive me with your lies. So it is with us. We are so sure about the nature of reality, what is and what is not, who we are and who others are, and it can bind us. It can blind us. Because, if another version of reality comes knocking at our door, our fixed ideas can keep us from accepting it. I'm too old. You can't teach an old dog new tricks. This is why I love this gospel. And this gospel, as it comes in its most earliest form, because I think it provides us with a God moment. It asks of us, how are you going to spend this brief life? This gospel ends in the middle of a sentence, and it begs the question, are we going to hold on stubbornly to, I know this to be true, and I'm like this, and you're like that? Or are we open to the gift of uncertainty? Are we going to move beyond our narrow mind? When is an ending not the end? When it's a new beginning. In Paul's letter to the church in Corinth, he makes clear that the resurrection faith that the early church had was not the result of wishful thinking on the part of the disciples. It was a radical intrusion that was shocking. Shocking. The resurrection of Jesus ushered in a new reality. That Easter morning, the two Marys and Salome didn't get it. What was unfolding before them did not compute. And in their grief, all they could think of was what had been and the need for a pious funeral and burial. But you know what? Jesus had gone on ahead to create a new age, a new possibility. The messenger said, Jesus is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Well, obviously the women must have obeyed that summons at some point, and they must have gone on to Galilee, or we wouldn't have the rest of the story. When is an ending not the end? When the ending depends on us. Because Easter morning propels us out of the graveyard and towards Galilee, where Jesus promises to meet us. And we also are filled with fear and many questions. And yet we are called to follow nonetheless. Frederick Buechner wrote these words, quote, "We want to know who Jesus is before we follow him." And that is understandable. It's understandable enough, except that the truth of the matter is That it is only by first following him that we can begin to find out who he is. You know, we still stumble around trying to get a handle on Christ, to get the measure of Christ. As a community of faith, we cling to what the church was in some supposed age of greatness. You know, I remember when we used to blah, blah, blah. You can fill in the blank. And we fail to recognize that the risen Christ is going ahead of us. The resurrection of Jesus is not the resuscitation of a corpse, nor is it the projection of some memory. It is the reign of God breaking through into a world of brokenness and death and transforming it. And we call it good news because Christ, the risen Christ, is still breaking through to transform us. For a person of faith, resurrection is a fact of daily life. I mean, think about it. When the power of addiction is defeated, when broken bodies are healed, when guilt is forgiven and anger is overcome, when failure is transformed, when barriers of injustice are broken down, when community is established and nurtured, the risen Christ is at work. The power to transform has been let loose on the world, and nothing can stop it, not even death itself. What we need is the humility and the curiosity and openness. This gospel ends with the women hanging on the word of the resurrection. And the resurrection is terrifying news. It's terrifying news for them as it is for us, because instead of the quiet certainty of death, no, now the future is wide open. Wide open and unknown and uncertain. An overhaul of our values, our loyalties, and our priorities. An overhaul is in order, because God is calling us to a life much bigger than the one we could carve out for ourselves. You know, I thank God the resurrection doesn't depend on me. And actually, I'm kind of glad the resurrection does not depend on you. Just as it didn't in the end depend on disciples. We don't make resurrection happen. God does. In the end, God's faithfulness is not contingent upon our own puny efforts. He is going ahead of you to Galilee. What can this mean for you and for us as a church? Well, Galilee is actually back home for them, back where they'd started. Jesus called the disciples into a radical new future, but not a radical new place. For most of us, most of the time, the radical obedience to the gospel message, the Easter message, will be lived out at home in our community. And you know what? Most of the time that takes the most courage anyway, right? That means that, you know, we don't have to travel to a monastery in the desert of Mount Sinai, in that area, to pursue a life of faith. We can pursue it right here. in Seattle, in Washington State, wherever our feet are planted. In our neat plastic wrapped world, where demons have been demythologized and visionaries and prophets are psychoanalyzed, the resurrection of Jesus in our midst is shocking. Like the women saying, like the women at the tomb, we need to listen to the messenger. Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. He's going ahead of you. You will see him, just as he told you. The resurrection will uncover what is killing you. Be humble. Be curious. Be open. Let go of your disappointed hopes and festering resentments. And let's get going. The messenger commands us, go and tell. Let's get on with things. Live as long as you are alive. Do what you have been given to do and see the miracle in it. Create space for the unexpected, for what can be neither bought nor sold. Make room for the resurrection. Thanks be to God. Amen.